Do you feel like you're running on a treadmill, like you're working hard but never actually getting ahead? Well, let me just tell you right now from the beginning, you're not alone in this. The paycheck to paycheck cycle is a trap. But let me just tell you right now, it's a trap that you can't escape. And today we're going to be exposing the hidden reasons why you're stuck, and we're going to lay out a clear path to financial freedom. So get ready to transform your finances and your future today. Well, hey everyone, and welcome to the live show. Where today we're going to be talking about that frustrating cycle of financial shame. It's why I do the show every day. It's that feeling of constant pressure, that feeling of not quite getting ahead, feeling like there's no way out. We're going to break down why this happens and how to escape it. Now, right now, I want to bring Craig into it. Craig is joining us right now. So, Craig, thank you for joining me today, my friend. How are you?
Well, sorry to be late. One of those days.
Hey, it's okay. We all have days like that. So, Craig, thank you again for joining me today. And like I was saying, we're going to break down how it feels like we're in this constant pressure of trying to break free of that financial shame that so many of us find ourselves in, and always quite feel like we're just not quite getting ahead, feeling like there's just no way out. And today on the show, we're going to really break down why this happens, but more importantly, we're going to start to lay a foundation of how we can escape it. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, we're going to see a little bit of a format change here going with the weekly shows every week, because what I wanted to do, Craig, and I know you and I've talked about this a little bit offline, is kind of refocus on what we covered in the last week of the shows. We're going to discuss some things we talked about, but this weekly show is going to be an opportunity for us to just go a little deeper. And today we want to start by how do you start to break free of that cycle? And I think the first thing we need to accept is this isn't a short-term solution. Nothing we're going to talk about today or nothing I talk about on the show is really one of those immediate things. And I think you've got to start looking at these things in the long term. Now, as it comes to breaking that paycheck to paycheck cycle, there's a lot of people out there that think as long as I cover the bills today, I'm doing okay. But I think we have to ask ourselves, is that really living? Ask yourself that question. Is that really living, or is it just surviving? So today I really want to go deep. I want to look at some real and some practical ways to do this. We're not just going to talk about numbers. We're talking about real life. We're talking about real struggles, and we're talking about real solutions. So let me pose this question to you as we get started here. Let's start with the big question. And that's this: are we really secure when we're living paycheck to paycheck? Now, we might feel like we're managing, we're just getting by. But in my personal view, I feel like it's just a dangerous illusion. It's kind of like you're going across this huge cavern, and you're on this tightrope. And this tightrope is just one unexpected expense away from a complete failure. That could be something like a car repair or maybe a medical bill. And then all of a sudden, everything falls apart. Well, I don't know about you, Craig, but for me, that's not security. That's really vulnerability. And today, I really want to help build a foundation that can withstand life's unexpected turns. So, Craig, I know you have a podcast called Live One Flourish, and I think one of the things you talk about on there is how people can get to that next level. So, how do you think this lack of security and lack of being financially secure impacts a person's overall well-being?
So to me, it comes down to uncertainty and anxiety, which are two things that are tightly coupled together. And so there are really multiple uncertainties at play when you're living paycheck to paycheck. Ralph, I'm sure you have experienced this. Yesterday, the AC guy was out to do a quarterly
Oh, that
service.
that is never fun.
Yeah, and so a part had burned out and, that wasn't too bad, but then the old AC, we've got 2 AC units, the old one needed $400 worth of Freon, and if your AC unit needs $400 worth of Freon, that means you're gonna need a new AC unit soon. So, I don't know, it's gonna be $10,000 or so. Now, fortunately, we've been blessed and we can afford that, but I had no idea that was coming up. Now, that kind of thing doesn't make me anxious because, like I said, we've been blessed and have the financial resources where if it does come up, I mean, I'm not going to be happy to write the check, but I'll be able to do it. But if you're living paycheck to paycheck and you live in Louisiana and summer is right ahead of you and you're looking at your AC being out, just the threat of the AC being out, I mean, that's a huge anxiety producer. And I think that's what a lot of it comes down to is you just even if you're paying the bills, you just there's always something unexpected, and you're just gonna be anticipating that, and that's the cycle of anxiety. That's what I see as the big impact.
Yeah, and I think you're right. And I think it's all about building that financial safety net, Craig. And that's what you're really talking about. Are you getting through today, but have you built that safety net? Like you said, I mean, what happens if you lose your job? What happens if your car breaks down? Or in your case, your AC goes out? How many of us have had that same moment of panic when this unexpected bill hits? And that's one of the things on the show I want to talk about. I think we need to have a mindset shift. I didn't say that quite right. A mindset shift. We need to shift from this survival instinct because I think all of us live in that from time to time, that survival mindset, and we need to move to that thriving mindset. And Craig, one of the things I heard you say there as you were going through that is, it comes down to having a cushion. It comes down to having savings, having a plan, and that's more than just getting by because one of the things you mentioned is the anxiety that comes alongside of that. And I think you very clearly said you've got that peace of mind because you don't have that anxiety because even though it's going to cost you a lot, and I know exactly what you're talking about. I guess I was about 21 years old. I bought my first townhouse. I think I shared this on the show before. I was there about 2 weeks and all of a sudden the air conditioning unit just blew up. And next thing you know, $5,000 later, and here we go. That's so we have to move beyond that feeling of just getting by. And I feel like so many people are sort of just coasting from paycheck to paycheck, but there's such a huge lack of security when it comes down to that. And how can you get past that and have that peace of mind if you're doing it that way?
Well, and when I was looking over the notes that you sent me, I was thinking about what does this make me think of? And it's a trap. I think you used the word stuck in your notes, and I think that's the perfect word. So it's almost financial quicksand if you're living paycheck to paycheck. And if everything's set steady, we've all seen the cartoons and the B movies where somebody's in quicksand, and as long as everything's steady, you're in good shape. But once it starts to suck you under, you start struggling and it just gets worse and worse and worse. And I think that's the feeling that a lot of people get when they're paycheck to paycheck.
I think you're absolutely right. And one of the things I want to bring out here, and we talk about this for a second, is it's not just about people who are low income. I mean, I see this in people at all income levels. I don't care whether you're making a $10,000 a year or $200,000 a year. I've seen people struggle at all levels of that. And I think one of the things we really need to focus in on, and if you really want to get past that, you want to break out of this cycle, you have to start looking at those hidden root causes. And I want to talk about a couple of those, Craig. And here's some that I mentioned in the show this past week. And these are just three of the big ones. That's that what I'll call lifestyle creep, emotional spending. And the big one is really debt. It's that credit card loans and how they hold us hostage. And I think we really need to start by shining a light on these hidden causes so that we can break free. Now, Craig, with your experience, what are some of the most common hidden root causes you see derailing people's finances?
Well, you hit on the big one. It's the credit card.
Yeah.
And a practice that fortunately has kind of gone down a little bit is that credit card companies used to be all over college campuses giving away free stuff. You get a free UD or, Louisiana Tech t-shirt or a tote bag or whatever. Oh, and we'll get you approved and here you go. Well, the kid gets all excited and they sign up and that's that. And then they treat their buddies to lunch and then, buy their girlfriend or boyfriend a little something. And the next thing you know, they've got a couple $1,000s in credit card bills at 24% interest. So I looked this up today. The average credit card interest in the US is like 24.2%.
Ouch.
So I did a little math, and if I figured this correctly, so let's say that I've got that $10,000 uh, air conditioner. So the easiest thing in the world is for me to take a credit card
Sure.
and pay for that thing. I don't have to watch my bank account go down. I can pay it off over time. It's really easy to do. But at 24% interest, if I paid $250 a month, it would take me 82 months. That's 7 years to pay it off. And the interest paid would be just a little bit more than that original $10,000. So you're ending up paying $20,000 for a $10,000 air conditioning unit. And it's
Absolutely.
just so easy. especially that minimum payment. It's terrible.
No, it's absolutely true, and I see that time and time again. It's almost like an anchor around someone's neck. It just pulls them down. One of the other things that I see a lot of, Craig, and I don't know if you see this as well, is that what we call lifestyle creep. As you start to make a little bit more money, you eat out more, maybe you get a better car, you get a bigger house. And I don't know about you, Craig, but I've fallen victim to that at times. I have to be honest. It seems like we have a good year or a good time. It's like, hey, you know what? Maybe I'll go buy that bigger car. Maybe maybe we can afford that bigger house, or maybe it's something as simple as just eating out more. I think that we just have to be aware of that. Have you experienced that yourself, some, Craig?
Yes, and I'm a little reluctant to tell this story, but I'm going to anyway.
Well,
So
thank you for your honesty.
when Tracy and I lived in St. Louis, we lived in a really great neighborhood called Lafayette Square. You could walk to restaurants and shops. It was just a great place. We had a lot of good friends there, and we would go out 4 or 5 times a week. I'd get off work, I'd swing by, pick up Tracy, and we'd go to our local restaurant. So if anybody from St. Louis is listening, it's Squires and Lafayette Square. Great place. We started spending about $1,200 a month at that restaurant. They were very sad to see us move, but, that's one restaurant. Now we had a lot of fun, we could afford it, we were lucky, and I know that's kind of extreme, but let's do some more math. So if you buy a fancy coffee and a pastry every day on your way to work, let's just say that's $10 a day, which is way low, or let's make the math easy, $10 a day. That's a little bit over $200 a month. So if you cut that in half, you've got an extra $100 a month that you can do something with, an emergency fund, paying down debt, whatever it might be. But that's just cutting back a little bit. And there are dozens of things in our lives that are like that, where we can cut back just a little bit and it'll make a big difference.
I absolutely agree with you. And I think another component too, and I don't know if you've ever experienced this, Craig, and thank you for sharing, by the way. I appreciate you saying that because I think when people realize that all of us go through this, it's not just the people listening, it's not just the person who might be struggling. I think I'd be fair to say that Craig and I are very blessed, but we've both been through cycles in our lives where, maybe we didn't make the best decisions or we made decisions that looking back at it now, maybe it was that lifestyle creep a little bit. Well, the other one I think, Craig, that I want to mention here, and I talked about that on the show this past week, is emotional spending. And that's a tough one, man. I don't know how many times I've found myself, kind of feeling down or, especially right now, like I am so busy with taxes and all that sort of thing. I don't have a lot of time for it. But then when I catch some free time, maybe I pop onto Amazon or something and say, what's some tech gadget that I really don't need, but I could use? And I feel like so often we get ourselves into a cycle of emotional spending as well. And I think there we really need to start thinking about that needs versus wants. And I know you've talked about that, Craig. Tell us about some of the things you've experienced with the needs versus wants thing.
Well, I think I mentioned this before, but it's really hard to separate those out, first of all. I do an exercise with my students where we talk about requirements versus wants, if you will, goal. We call them goals. Well, on the surface, we know some things are requirements, but what about that new shirt? If your shirts are getting a little ratty and it's important for you to, look professional at work, is that a need or is that a want? And so I think some things you can put in the needs category, some things you can put in the wants category. But what I would encourage people to do is to focus on those ones where you have to think about. And can you push some of those into that wants so you can defer a little bit? And you may find that you really need it, but most of the time you'll find that you don't, especially if you can make it more of kind of a cold, rational analysis. Maybe take a third party view. If Ralph was giving me advice on this, what would he say? That's what I try to do. But it's a lot harder than it sounds to separate out some needs from some wants.
It is. And one of the exercises that I recommended on the show last week is maybe go through 30 days worth of your spending and simply just take each item and say, is that a need or is that a want? Because I think when you do that, and I think you're right, Craig, there are some gray areas in that. There really are. there are some things that you're like, well, yeah, it's kind of a need, it's kind of a want. But I think if you at least look at the analysis, do some analysis of the situation, just go through your credit card statement or go through your bank account for the past 2 weeks or the past 30 days and just put an N or a W next to it. Was that a need or was that a want? I think you can really open your eyes to some things that you might not have seen otherwise.
And I've got a little technique that might work for people. Play a little what if. What if I defer this purchase for 30 days or for a week or whatever makes sense in that circumstance? Can you, do you, if you need it, do you need it right now? So maybe you don't need that new shirt, or you can put a little bit more polish on that pair of shoes or whatever. I don't know why I'm on a clothing kick here today, but just maybe you can defer it a little bit. And what you might find is that, okay, when you get to that 2 weeks or 30 days or whatever, you really did need it. But more often, you're going to find that you didn't.
Absolutely,
A-
Craig. And
And
I'll be talking about that on the show this week. I'm going to use a term called my power pause. And that's what I want to call a power pause. Is a 24-hour hold before you make that decision to buy something. Is you just say, look, Ralph said the power pause. I'm going to apply the power pause. And I think that helps you move beyond that emotional decision, and you really check your gut and you ask yourself the question, do I really need this? Or is this trying to fill some emotional need? And I think it's brilliant what you said, Craig. And I think you mentioned this on the show before is park things in your online shopping cart and go back to them 2 or 3 days later and say, do I really need this? I made it through my life before today without it. So maybe I can make it a few more weeks or a few more months, or maybe I don't need it at all.
that totally works. That totally works. Tracy and I have been doing that this year. And, for a lot of things, we've said, yeah, I don't really need this. Now, dog treats, if it's dog treats, we just order those right away. If we're low on greenies, that's an emergency. I don't want those dogs coming after me. So,
No, I'll tell you what, at our house, we've got a German Shepherd, and Chewy stops at our place at least once a month, sometimes more frequently than that. And you're right, you don't get in the way of that. There is no cutting back when it comes to the dog treats. But Craig, a few minutes ago, you talked about breaking free of that debt. And you mentioned, and you didn't say the latte factor, but I'm going to call it that latte factor. And I think one of the things that a lot of people overlook is those small daily expenses. They add up. Do you have one of those you were thinking about, Craig? I know you gave us an explanation, but have you ever found yourself in that same sort of that same what I call the latte factor cycle?
I quit going out to lunch. So I bring my breakfast and bring my lunch to campus with me. Then, I miss every once in a while I'll go out because there's some socializing that goes on that's important, but you don't need to do that 5 days a week. And especially with prices the way they are. I mean, you go to a fast food place and, you've dropped a $20 bill or close to it. So think about that. Every day going out to lunch. Well, can you go out to lunch twice a week? Don't think about big things. These little things can make a big difference. And they often have secondary benefits as well. Like my lunches are a lot healthier now. May not be as tasty, but they're a lot healthier now.
That's absolutely true. And I say this to my youngest son as a barber. And, he sits around the barber shop when it's not busy and he says, Dad, a lot of times there's a Buffalo Wild Wings a couple doors down from his place. And he says, Dad, I just love to go over there and I can get all you can eat this or that. And I said, okay, son, but you just dropped 25 bucks. And I said, you're making $15 an hour plus tips. He says, Dad, but you don't understand. It gets, I say, I do understand. I said, I make quite a bit more than you. And guess what I do every day? I pack a brown bag for lunch. Now, for me, fortunately, I can run over to the house. I'm right here on the farm, and it's not far. But I very rarely go out to lunch. And it's funny, Craig, because I have people I come in and do some financial coaching with them, and most of the time they'll bring a Starbucks cup with them. And I'm not picking on Starbucks, but I'm like, you want me to help you with your finances, and you're sitting there with a $10 drink on the table, and I'm going, how often do you do this?
You hit on something that might be another good technique for people to try. It's how long do I have to work to buy this thing? Especially if you start really doing it in the right way and you mentally take out the taxes and, that sort of thing. So if you're making $30 an hour, you're really making what, $24 an hour, something like that.
Absolutely.
And so you've got to work for 30 minutes to buy that coffee and donut. Yeah, is this really worth 30 minutes of my labor to buy it. And if it is and you can afford it, well, all right. But most of the time, you'll find that the pleasure that you get out of it is not equivalent to the work you put in. I think a lot of people will also find that they're paying a lot for convenience. So being able to just go get that latte is pretty convenient, but you pay for it. You absolutely pay for it.
Which leads me right to the next discussion I want to talk about. And I talked about that a lot this week on the show, and that's an emotional toll we have here. Like, it's easy to look at the financial toll. I mean, the financial toll is easy to see. My credit card balance is going up. But let's talk about that emotional toll. You know, that constant worry. You mentioned this a few minutes ago, that fear, that anxiety. A lot of people are translating to feeling distant from God, and they start questioning, is God really giving me the provision? And one of the things, I mentioned this to my son on Sunday, I said, son, when's the last time you prayed about your finances? He looked at me like I had horns. He says, Dad, you're not supposed to talk about that with God. And I said, yeah, you do need to talk about that with God, because the truth is, I truly believe this at my very core. God doesn't want us to be burdened. He really doesn't. He wants us to find peace. Now, that peace that he's giving us might not be the peace that you think you deserve, which is a whole nother discussion. We could probably talk for an hour about that. But Craig, how do you advise people, when you're helping them, how to deal with that stress of finances? I know we're dealing with I won't say teenagers, but young adults in college. I'm sure this crosses your path sometimes. How do you help them to deal with that emotional weight of that financial stress?
There are two things. One is more actionable than the other, but I want to throw this out there. So a lot of our suffering comes from attachment. I mean, that comes out of Buddhism, but it's also in the Bible. We get attached to something, and just the mere thought of not having that thing can cause a lot of suffering. And so if you can kind of detach yourself from all those extra financial things and, financial resources and the benefits that they might bring, you know, have you ever, let me be a little off point here. Have you ever lived in a really crappy apartment?
I did actually. I remember when I first was getting ready to finish college, I met my first wife, and we moved into one of those ground floor apartments. And yeah, I mean, the windows were up at the top of the room, and I just felt like I was living in this constant state of basement. It kind of had a musty smell to it. And right across from us was the laundry room. So constantly people down there making noise and all that sort of thing. So I think I know where you're going, Craig, but go ahead, fill us in with where
Well,
you're going.
maybe. So I was in Tampa a few weeks ago and went for an early morning walk and found my old apartment from when I was in grad school. And it was a crappy apartment there then, and it's an expensive, crappy apartment now. But I had the best time there. It was one of the best times of my life. I didn't care that the paint wasn't all that great. I mean, it was safe and the air conditioning worked and that kind of thing. Now I've got this nice house and a pool and pastures and all these kinds of things. And am I happier? Maybe in some ways, but not so much in others. And the happiness that I feel now is not as connected to all those things. So I don't know if I'm making any sense here, but I think sometimes we think we need these things to be happy, and you don't. We convince ourselves that we need those things to be happy. So that's really the kind of macro, the big high level thing that I wanted to mention. But the one that's more actionable is just do something. So we feel a lot of stress and anxiety when we feel completely out of control. And so if you can do one little thing to start to take a little bit of control over your financial health, you will find that you start to feel better. Whether it's I'm going to open that savings account and put whatever the minimum is, or I'm going to, you know, cut the lattes down to twice a week or 3 times a week. I'm going to start taking these steps to take some kind of control. We feel a lot of anxiety and stress when we feel like circumstances are beyond our control. But your financial health is not beyond your control. For anybody that can afford to listen to this, they have something that's under their control financially. And if you're feeling stressed out, start to take action.
I agree with you. And I use an analogy on the show this week about bricks. I remember when I first bought the farm here, I had an entrance built, one of these brick columns at the front end. And I'll forget the guy who came out, the brick mason to come out and do it. And he says, all right, well, we'll do this and we'll do that. And in my mind, I kind of had an idea what that would look like. And I remember Delaware Brick Company brought this big old block box of or block of bricks. They were all put together with like I call them cable ties, but they were metal cable ties. And there was like three of those, and they dropped them off, Craig. And I'm thinking, I can't picture this now. All I see is these individual bricks. And I remember I was standing there staring at the guy, and I probably gave him a complex as he was starting to work. But I just remember him taking that first brick, and he set the first brick, and then he set that second brick. And your finances can work the exact same way. It's as simple as taking that first brick and putting it into place. Because think about how you feel right now when you're stuck in that financial cycle. It's affecting your sleep. Hey, it's affecting your relationships. It's affecting your overall well-being. And that financial impact is huge. It can cause arguments with your boyfriend, girlfriend, your husband, wife, spouse. It creates tension. All of those things come into that same thing. And I just want to share something with the group here today. And that is, I want to encourage you with this Bible verse. And it comes from the book of Philippians, and it's chapter 4, verses 6 and 7. So as you're thinking about starting that out, here's a Bible verse that you can kind of put on a piece of paper and read this. And it says this, it says, do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. So really, if you think about that, take those bricks one by one, but realize that you can do this. You know, you can break free, but it starts with putting those first bricks together. And Craig, I like what you said. Start with that simple, emergency fund. Maybe it starts by building a budget. Not and now I'm talking about a budget that feels like you're in prison. And I talked about that on this show this week. So many people hear the word budget, and I'm going to transition here a little bit, Craig. But they hear that term budget and they think, okay, Ralph's talking about going to prison here. Because all they see is restriction. But what they don't understand, and I shared this with my son on Sunday. I said, son, do you have a budget? He goes, Dad, here we go again. You're going to tell me how to spend my money. I said, no, son, but think about the difference between restriction and intention. And see, if you do budgeting right, and I was on another show, and this lady, she has a blog that she writes. She actually lives in Kenya now. Her and her husband are missionaries. And she said, Ralph, she goes, I like to use the word intentional spending plan. And I told her, I said, Karen, I'm stealing that. I'm going to use that for the rest of my life because it's so true. But that's one of those tools, that intentional spending plan. Like I said to my son, I said, now all of a sudden, just like that brick mason, he's telling that brick where to go. He's putting it. A budget works the exact same way. You're showing that money. You're assigning that dollar where to go. And to me, that's the ultimate level of control. So if you feel out of control with your finances, one of the best ways you can do it, what I'll call a game changer, is to give every dollar a job. It's that simple. This dollar is this job. This dollar is rent. This dollar is insurance. This dollar is gasoline. This dollar is car payment. And that is so crucial, is if we assign the dollars a job. Because you're right, Craig, if you're listening to this right now, you've got enough resources to be able to make a dynamic change, but it only takes that first brick.
Well, that's how most people get into financial difficulties. I mean, there are extreme cases where it's a big medical bill or something like that, but the vast majority of people that find themselves paycheck to paycheck, it happened one little decision at a time. And you can unwind it the same way. Just make one better decision at a time, and you'll find it makes a huge difference. Wait, I know, Ralph, you've lost a bunch of weight.
Well, thank you for
And
noticing.
well, I meant you have, but over your lifetime, I know
Oh, absolutely.
you
Yeah,
and I both lost over.
there was a time when I was, I'll share with the group. I guess it's about 15 years ago, I went to the doctor and I got on the scale and I was 420 pounds.
Wow.
And my blood pressure was 200 over 100. The doctor looked me in the eye and he says, you're going to pop. But go ahead. I'm sorry. But I just want to share with that because, yeah, I mean, and it started by losing that first pound.
That's right. And so did you drop the 100 whatever pounds in a month?
I wish,
No.
man. It's taken 15 years, Craig. And it's funny you bring this up because just the other day, I noticed that I am the lowest I've weighed in 30 years.
Congratulations.
But that's 15 years it took me to get to that point.
Wha- And I'm actually going to relate this to the giving every dollar its job. So a couple of times I've had to lose a bunch of weight. Um, I got not quite that high, but I was north of 350 for a while. And what I found is if you write down everything you eat, it makes you pause just long enough to be intentional. Like I had a birthday not long ago. There was a birthday cake. A couple of us had birthdays around the same time, so they had a little thing at the office. I ate some birthday cake. That got recorded, but that was an intentional thing. It wasn't, "Here's some cake." It's like, it's gonna be pretty awkward if I don't eat some, and people, went through a lot of effort to do all of this, and so, I'm gonna eat some cake. Now, I probably didn't need to eat as big a piece as I ate, but that's intentionality. And so even if you're not ready to have that intentional spending plan, just write down everything that you spend. Write down absolutely everything that you spend, and you'll find that you spend less. I guarantee you.
You're absolutely true. And I say this on my show all the time. What gets measured gets done. And if you write down everything, if you measure everything, and if you look at every dollar as having a purpose, then yeah, you can make a dynamic change. And look, I didn't put that weight on overnight. That was the Krispy Kreme donuts and the Dunkin' Donuts around here and the Pepsis at bedtime. And so now, like, to be honest with you, Craig, like over the last 3 or 4 months, I eat nothing after dinner. I do what I call intermittent fasting, basically from 7 p.m. till 7 a.m. I eat nothing. And it's just amazing, like, how much of an impact that makes, but that's intentional. And I think you're great. I think you're right. Sometimes you have to accept that, it's not going to be perfect. And you're going to make that intentional decision. You made that intentional decision to have that cake. And you know what? Now I'm jonesing for some birthday cake, man. You've set me up now.
But let's say that you only lost half of the weight that you did. You're still a lot better. You were still gonna be a lot better off.
Oh, absolutely. And it doesn't take
A lot.
much. It
Yeah.
doesn't take much. I mean, and that's the same thing with your finances. If you can set up, like we talked a few minutes ago about that emergency fund, and everybody says, well, Ralph, you say you need 3 to 6 months worth of your income for emergency fund. Yes, that'd be great. In a perfect world, that's fantastic. But guess what? If you had $100 in your emergency fund, that's 10 times better than having $10 in your emergency fund. I'll give you an example of this on Sunday. My son is so excited. Now, and I feel like I talk about my son all the time, but he's my youngest son and he's around town, so we get to spend more time together. And he says, Dad, he says, you're never going to believe this. He said, look at how much I have in my savings account. And he hands me his phone, Craig. And this kid was beaming from ear to ear. And he had $1,000 in a high yield savings account. And I
Good
said
for
to him, son, I'm so proud of you because here's the kid that I would have said spent money that he'll never see. And now he's got this $1,000 savings account. And I'm like, great job, son. Now, is that
you.
3 months of his income? Absolutely not. But man, that is huge for him.
Well, and you've hit on something really important. I think a lot of people look at where they are and look at what all the financial gurus say should be the case. And they think, "Well, I'm never gonna get there. I've got no savings, and you're telling me I need 6 months." That's just never gonna happen. So I'm not gonna do anything. And that's really a mindset shift that people need to undergo. It's like, "Okay, I may not be able to get to this goal, but I can get part of the way there." And what people will find is that once they get going and feel that I know pride gets a bad rap sometimes, but they feel that satisfaction of movement in the right direction, they'll accelerate. I'm sure you felt that with the weight loss where, once it got going, man, it felt really good and you wanted to keep going.
And what you're talking about is momentum, and I use this on the show this week. I mean, picture this snowball that starts off real small and it starts to roll downhill and it gains and it gains and it gains. And you're right, Craig. It's so easy to have that defeatist mentality of like, well, I'll never do this. Save $1 a day.
Yeah.
Save $5 a week. You might be saying, Ralph, yeah, you can do that. And the thing is, I think it's important. And I want to bring this up now and I mentioned this on the show this past week. It's crucial to celebrate those small wins. And I think that's a lot of times, we look at all around us and we say, oh, I'm not doing everything I could do. But you are. Celebrate those small wins. I remember going back to that analogy of the guy building the wall. When he got a little bit done, I was like, that looks really good. And he didn't have but 10% of it done. So when you pay off that small debt, celebrate that. Now, don't go out and get more debt. I'm not saying to celebrate it by going that way. But if you pay off a small debt, celebrate. If you save a little, celebrate. If you stick to your budget for a week, celebrate these things. These are victories and they build momentum and they keep us going. And listen, I don't know about you, Craig, but I don't think you should underestimate the power of celebrating because every step forward is a step in the right direction. And I think you're right, Craig. It's so easy to get stuck in that quagmire of just being in the middle of this cycle. And you're like, I can't get through it. That's why I call it shame, because you live in this constant state of shame. And I hate to say this, and this is going to sound very negative, but it's almost self-imposed. Because most of the time, now I'm not saying, hey, listen, if you're disabled and you can't work, or you've had some kind of traumatic brain injury or something like that, that's not what we're talking about today. If that's your situation, that's not what we're talking about today. But if you have the capacity to do, if you have the capacity to work, if you have the capacity to make good mental decisions, then you can celebrate those things. And that's progress. It really is.
Well, I want to kind of take off from there with 2 points. One is give yourself some grace. You know, God gives us grace. Be a little bit like God and give yourself some grace. You're going to have stumbles. Things are going to go wrong, and that's okay. Um, you can let yourself slide from time to time as long as it's not, constant. The other thing is you cannot control the past. You can't even control the present. The only thing you can do is control the future. And so all that stuff that you did in that past, all the things that you threw money away on, that's all gone. So forget about that and move forward. And so what your goal needs to be is to be better off tomorrow than you were today. You cannot go in and unspend that money. You just can't. And
And Craig,
so
that's the
think
secret
about that.
sauce. It's so much of the secret sauce because so many people get stuck in their mistakes of the past. Well, guess what? The past is the past. You can't fix it. You're not going to change it. Start today. Just like a diet. There's so many times when, and I'm not an alcoholic, but you fall off the wagon, right? That's the analogy I think all of us can understand. Well, if you have a bad day, you eat too much. Well, guess what the next morning is? Get up, get out of bed, do some exercise, and make better decisions. And that's one of the things. It's so hard. Sometimes we feel like the progress is slow, but what you have to understand is you didn't get into debt overnight. You didn't make these bad financial decisions overnight. These things have been building and building. And you have to just focus on the progress. It's so easy to get stuck on that destination. You might get in your mind, well, I've had so many clients say this, I want to be debt free. Hey, great. Guess what? You're not going to get there next week. But you can make progress. And it's about celebrating that during the journey. So Craig, one of the things I want to ask you about, how have you helped others sort of encourage them? What are some ideas that you have for encouraging people?
Well, it's really that slow, steady approach. Is that you need to just realize that life is a journey, and you're going to have your ups and downs. There are going to be the successes and the setbacks, and you just keep going. And most of the time, you'll be all right. I mean, I've had a number of friends that have gotten themselves in financial trouble, and it's like, okay, what are you going to do today? I mean, I know I don't know if we've talked about this, but I fancy myself as a bit of a stoic, and one of their core ideas is some things are under your control and some things are not. And so forget about all the things. This is my big message: is forget about all those things that are outside of your control, which would include everything you've done in the past. What are you going to do now to take control of your financial future? That's what you need to think about. That's what you need to focus on, and that's what you need to do. The rest of it, learn from it, doesn't matter anymore, move on. What can you control? And then do that thing. Even if it's one tiny thing, do that thing.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that we can do as well is we can encourage others by telling them about our successes. And I think that's one of the things that we need to do. I think we need to share with people. One of the things I say to people all the time is that we do a really bad job. And I'm not picking on you, Craig, but just in general, it's going to feel like I'm picking on you, but I don't mean it. Education, we don't do a good job of teaching kids how to manage their money. It's just not taught well. And we wonder why they're struggling. We wonder why they don't. It's funny. I hired a new younger person to work for me here, and she came to me the other day because one of our clients came in. And he's really having a hard time with his hands, and she goes, "He wants me to write the check, Ralph." She said, "I've never written a check." And I said, "Well, some of that's age-wise. Like they just don't write checks anymore and all that kind of thing. But think about, how can we? And one of the things I talked about on the show this past week was how do we think long-term and how do we start building that legacy? And one of the things that I think we really need to talk about is, how do we build that legacy? How do we teach our kids about money? Because listen, it comes to a point, at some point, where our kids are going to be taking care of us or helping us. And if they don't have the tools to understand how to invest or understand how to save or understand how to budget, man, we're going to be in trouble, Craig. What do you think about that?
No, well, so you said a lot there, that's important. So you can't outsource this to the schools. Like what we have a personal finance class here. When I was dean at Northern Arizona, we started a personal finance class and actually created a financial literacy simulation for Native Americans that went international. Got written up in like Business Week or something like that. It was a big deal, but that's the exception. It's not the rule. We have to take. I'm not a parent, but parents have to take responsibility. Friends can help other friends learn how to become financially literate. Um, but the other thing is, it's not that hard. It really isn't. I mean, when you think about it, at its core, it's about intentionality. It's about separating needs from wants. It's about not trying to keep up with the Joneses or whatever the equivalent of that is today, the Instagrams. It's a bunch of little things like that that will serve them not only it'll serve them well not only in their financial life, but in life in general. And so you need to know kind of how to calculate interest rates and or what interest costs are going to be and how to compare different kinds of deals and that sort of thing. So there's some skills like that, but I think a lot of it, I'll go back to mindset. It's this mindset around a few core ideas that really will do a lot of the work.
You're absolutely right. And I say this to clients all the time. It's not rocket science. In a lot of ways, it's pretty simple. It's kind of like a diet. I mean, we've been talking about diets a lot, but if you eat more than what you expend in calories a day, you're going to gain weight.
Right.
It's the same thing with spending. If you spend more than you make, you're going to gain debt. And if you look at it in those simple terms, like you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure this out. Now, you mean you need to understand intentionality, and I think you need to understand impacts of decisions, which is what you're alluding to there. But this is not terribly complicated. I
And,
think
and
the problem is so many people just don't go back and look at where their money goes. I think if there's one big takeaway from today, I think that's the big two takeaways. So many people just don't understand where their money goes. I had a couple in the other day, and you can tell they make good money between the two of them, making well over $150,000 each. And they said to me, Ralph, we're really accumulated a lot of credit card debt, and we're really struggling. And I said, yeah, it's funny because I said, it doesn't matter how much money you make, does it? They said, no. And I said, well, let me ask you a question. How much did you spend on eating out last month? And he goes, oh, you got me on that one, Ralph. He says, I knew that's what you're going to ask me. I have no idea. I said, yeah, exactly. I said, you have no concept of where your money's going. So how do you think you're going to manage it?
yeah, yeah, exactly. Well, and I think there's another big message that we've kind of been around the edges of here, and that's don't live life by accident. I think a lot of people just kind of go with the flow, not in a positive way, like, let's go out to eat, or yeah, let's get a new car, or let's do this, or let's do that. And they lack that intentionality. And that probably creeps into other aspects of their lives as well. So I think that's a big message from today is live with some intention. Don't live life by accident.
No, absolutely right. And I think that, I mean, intentionality is the answer, right? I mean, and it really comes down to that, which leads me to my final topic I want to talk about today. And, we talked a lot about being stuck. We talked a lot about, what do we do to get out of there? But I also think we also need to look at what does that future look like? What does that legacy look like? And one of the shows I did last week was talking about legacy planning. And you might say, well, Ralph, wait a second. I'm just trying to figure out how to pay my bills this week. But I think that it helps you if you have that goal, if you have that plan. What does that legacy look like for you? What does it mean for you? What do you want to leave? It's about more than providing for your family. It could be something like, what is important to you. And Craig, I don't know when you're working with young adults, and you probably don't get into these discussions because they're so young, but I think that one of the things that we can do is really start thinking about what that long term looks like, and start early and lead by example. And one of the things that I think that we can do is really have open conversations about our finances, because I think that's so important. And one of the things that I see a lot of families struggle with is they're not honest with their kids and say, because I've caught myself in this too. As the parent, you just want to be the provider. Oh, we're going to go on vacation and we're going to do this. But I think it's so important to sit down with your kids and talk about, well, listen, if we do this, we can't afford to do that. If we put the swimming pool in the backyard, that means there's no summer vacations anymore because the summer vacation's 3 steps out the back porch. And I think that we don't do a good job. And I hate to pick on parents, but I think we need to share with our kids, like, what does things actually cost? And I think that we're doing our children a disservice if we don't do that. But at the same time, we also have to think about, what is our goal? What is our plan? What do we want to leave for our kids? What do we want to leave for our grandkids? I think that is so important. What is your thoughts on that?
Well, again, I'm not a parent, but I think one of the big things parents can leave their kids, and this is going to sound a little corny, is lessons. Lessons. And you're getting, you were kind of getting into that with, if we get the pool, we can't do this. Well, you're teaching them that your choices have implications. And, if we want this pool, that's going to mean some good things and it's going to mean some not so good things. And okay, let's sit down as a family and try to decide what we want to do. And I think that maybe that's the big legacy we want to be leaving the next generation. I, I do have one insight though on younger people today that might be useful. If you're talking to somebody who's younger, they will largely not be as worried about money as we were,
Huh.
not as driven by money. They're much more driven by how they're going to make a mark on the world and what they're going to contribute to the world, and that's fantastic. So there's nothing wrong with that. That's a wonderful thing. But if you don't take care of your financial health, just like your physical health, you're not going to be able to have the same impact on the world as if you do have good financial health. And so I think that's a big message that anybody out there that's working with young people can pass along is, yeah, you don't need to be a billionaire. But if you're scraping to get by, you're not going to be able to go on that mission trip, or you're going to have to take the job that pays more, even though it's less rewarding, or you're going to have to do this, or you're going to have to do that. Financial health equals freedom. And that's what younger people really want. And they're not going to get that if they're financially unhealthy.
I think you're absolutely right. And it's not just about getting out of a bad situation. It's about transforming your mindset. It's about changing that mindset, changing your habits, understanding your relationship with money, and being good stewards of what God has given us. Because it's like you said, Craig, and you nailed it. I put this in my notes. It's funny you walk right into it. We're not just aiming for financial stability. We're aiming for financial freedom. And with that financial freedom gives you that ability to do the other things that are important to you. And I think that is so crucial. You can be generous. You can do investments. You can leave a lasting legacy for other people. I really think that's so important because, Craig, you're right. Because you get to a certain point, it's like the job doesn't matter as long as you've got that baseline. Because you got to be able to make money. You got to be able to pay your bills. But I think that when you get those things sorted out, one of the things I talk about all the time is, look, you are never going to get financially ahead or able to bless somebody else until you figure out your own stuff.
Right.
I say this to people all the time at church. We talk about this at church. How do we giving up? I said, well, one of the things we really need to stress at church is how to get people better financially. It's easy to say to them, stand in a pulpit on Sunday and say, hey, we need to bring in more money. We need to raise more money. Okay, well, what are you doing to teach your congregation how to be better financial stewards so they can bless the missionary that comes in and needs some extra money? I think that's so important.
And absolutely. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
And I just want to give everybody some next steps. One of the things that I want to do with the show moving forward is I want to give people some ideas, some things they can do. And so I wrote down a few ideas today. One of the things I think we really should focus in on, and I talked about it in the show this past week, is starting to build what I call a financial awareness journal. And that's as simply as making notes of, hey, I saved this today. I made this decision. I put it on that pause that I didn't buy something. I decided to brown bag it. I decided to not buy that, we're picking on coffee again, that latte. And I think if you put those things into a journal, then you can see those blocks, those building blocks, because, it's easy to say, well, I get to the end of the week, I don't really see anything. Well, go read your journal from last week and look at those decisions. Because maybe Tuesday you decided I was going to go eat out. And I said, you know what? I could pack a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and it cost me $1 in raw materials to make it at home. I just saved $25. I think that's so huge. I think the other thing is to get that intentional spending plan, get that budget into place. I think that's just one of the things. If you don't listen to anything else Craig and I talked about today, we talked about intentionality. And I think that is so very important. And what goes along with that is celebrating those small wins. I think you heard Craig and I both talk about that. When you have that small win, it's a small win today, but those things just grow and they grow. And like I use that analogy again, that brick wall, when it was done, man, I stood back and I go, how did he figure out how to intertwine all those bricks one by one? And then the other thing, I think you got to keep your eyes on the long game. And I think that's so important. And because as a Christian show, I think, got to keep your faith at the center of this. And just know, like I said to my son on Sunday, son, it's okay to say to God, hey, God, I'm fouling this up. Or, hey, God, help me. I don't know I don't know how to make better decisions. And I'm not one of these people that thinks that, you're going to hear this boisterous, this is God talk. I don't think you're going to hear that. But I think you will hear subtle little whispers. You know what I'm saying, Craig? I think you'll hear subtle little whispers. How does any of that hit you, Craig?
Yeah, I think so. I would agree with that. And even the act of going to God with that sort of a problem is a step towards control. But have I told the joke about the guy that fell off the cliff?
I don't believe so. Let's hear it.
No, let me see if I can remember this. So this guy's on a hike. It's kind of a foggy morning, and he steps over and falls off a cliff. And he grabs onto a branch, just like on the cartoons, and he's hanging there. And he calls out to God, God, please save me. And a little while later, somebody comes by and looks down and sees him and runs and gets a rope and throws it down. Grab a hold of the rope. And the guy that's hanging on to the branch says, no, God will provide. And so the guy with the rope walks off, but he calls the fire department. Fire department comes out, puts a ladder down. Come on, climb up on the ladder. God will provide. And the fire department leaves, but they called the search and rescue people who sent a helicopter out. So the helicopter comes out, they deploy the ladder, try to get the guy on the ladder. No, God will provide. Well, you can kind of see what's going to happen. Eventually he loses his grip, he falls and he dies. He gets to heaven and he goes, God, I put all my faith in you. Why did you forsake me? He said, what do you mean forsake you? I sent you the guy with the rope. I sent you the fire department. I sent you the helicopter. And so we've got to be willing to take action as well. Ralph, I'm not sure you like that joke. But
No, I love it. And you teed it up for exactly what I wanted to say next. And I want to encourage everybody listening today, what's one action item? Just one thing that you're going to do this week to improve your financial situation. Just pick one thing, whether it's the ladder, it's the hose, it's the ladder hanging from the helicopter. Exactly what Craig's talking about. I heard a preacher say it the other day, and I thought this was great. He says, they talk about in the Bible how the birds don't worry about where their next meal's coming from. But this guy was brilliant. He said, yeah, but the birds got out of the nest. And so you've got to take that action. You got to do that action step. Craig, I just want to thank you so much. Craig, you've been a great help today. Your wisdom is very much appreciated. And I just want to preview this week's shows coming up. This week, I'm going to be talking about budgeting. We're going to go a little bit deeper. I'm going to talk about breaking impulsive spending. We talked a little bit about today. I'm going to be talking about that on the show. We're going to be talking about the first steps to building that emergency savings account. I'm going to do a show called Credit Cards Friend or Foe. We're going to talk about how to use credit cards wisely. And then I'm finally going to kind of round out this week with talking about planning for expenses. Planning for those expenses you can see on the horizon. They're coming. I think, Craig, you may have had this with the HVAC, maybe. I'm not sure if that was a planned expense, but you probably had it in your mind. Hey, this thing's getting to that age where it's about time. But we're all going to move forward on trying to break out of that cycle. So again, thank you for joining us today. Remember, excuse me, I got this all fouled up, Craig. So what happens when you try to do stuff live? But let me start that over again. Remember that. This is a journey, not a sprint. And I'm going to encourage you right now to subscribe to our newsletter. You can do that by going to askralphpodcast.com/newsletter. And I'll share you a daily, just some information every day that you might benefit from it. If you know somebody that can benefit from the show, maybe you know somebody that's dealing with some financial troubles, and you say, hey, Ralph can really help them, or join us weekly when Craig and I do it together. But I just want to thank you so much. And as I always end this show, may you all be financially savvy, and may God bless you as you confidently, and I really believe this, Craig, you confidently break free from that cycle of financial shame. So we'll see you again next week.
Thank you for joining us on the Ask Ralph Show. And with a simple click to subscribe, we'll invite you back to our next episode. And remember, financial issues don't have to be complicated. Just ask Ralph. The information contained in this episode of Ask Ralph is based on data available as of the date of its release. Saggio Accounting Plus and Ask Ralph Media, Inc. is under no obligation to update this content if changes occur. Applying this information to your specific situation requires careful consideration of all facts and circumstances, and any information provided is not to be considered as financial, tax, or legal advice. Please consult your tax advisor or attorney before acting on any material covered.